You're going to learn 50 chess principles broken into 3 categories: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Let's begin. Principles number 1 through 9 fall into the beginner category and are going to be most helpful to players rated less than 1,000. Principle number 1 is to control the center of the board, primarily these 4 squares. The reason that this is good is because pieces in the center of the board control more squares than pieces somewhere else. If we look at this knight in the corner, notice that it can only go to 2 squares. If we look at this knight on the side, it's a little bit better. It can go to 4 squares. This knight is even better. It can go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares. But this knight in the center is best of all. It can go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares. This is generally going to be true for other pieces as well. They are usually more effective in the center of the board. So the player who controls the center of the board is going to have more options to put their pieces there. At the start of the game, a great way to start, if possible, is to get your 2 center pawns forward, followed by the knights defending the pawns. If you can achieve this at the start of the game, you're already off to a good start. Principle number 2 is that you want to develop your knights and your bishops as quickly as possible. That simply means get them off of the back and into the game right away. For example, in this game, white does a great job of developing this piece. Black does not. Here again, white does a great job of developing a piece. Black does not. And so already white has a significant advantage in the position because they have 2 powerful pieces that are able to start doing stuff, and black's pieces are just sitting on the back. Principle number 3 is that you want to try to castle before move 10. In this position, white has done a great job of developing the knight and the bishop on the king side, which allows the king to castle early. And if you're following the other principles of fighting for the center using these 2 pawns, usually you're going to have a wall here of other pawns remaining, which act as a nice shield for your king. This is a very safe place for your king to be. You fight in the center using your other pieces, and you leave the king off to the side. And so that's why if you can castle before move 10, that is a great strategy to keep your king safe and not get checkmated early. Principle number 4 kind of goes along with what we've already talked about, but avoid making too many pawn moves in the opening phase of the game. You can see if we follow this game out, black is doing a terrible job here, moving way too many pawns, and white is doing a good job of following the principles. And after just 7 moves, white is already in a borderline winning position because they have so many pieces that are attacking things that black has to be really, really careful, and they're not really using any of their pieces, okay? So avoid those pawn moves early in the game. Principle number 5 is to avoid bad bishops. So a bad bishop is a bishop that is stuck behind a pawn chain. So in this position, when black played the move d6, they created a bad bishop on f8. This bishop is stuck behind the pawn. Remember, it can't jump over pieces. It doesn't have a lot of options. You only have one place that that bishop can move to. White, on the other hand, moved this bishop out first, and now if they wanted to push this pawn up 1, that's totally fine. The bishop is already outside of the pawn chain. Okay, this is the pawn chain. Bishop's already out. Look at all the squares that it's controlling. That is so much better. So what black should have done instead, if they're going to move this pawn, they need to get the bishop out first and then move this pawn later. Principle number 6 is to avoid moving the same piece multiple times in the opening. In the game that I'm about to show you, white does a great job of following this principle and black does not. Watch what happens. e4, e6, d4. Bishop comes out with check. The problem with that is now white plays c3, which blocks the check, but at the same time attacks the bishop. Now black has to waste time moving the bishop again. Then white develops. Black decides they don't like the bishop over there. Spend another move. So they've now moved the bishop 1, 2, 3 times. It's the same piece moving 3 times. They're definitely breaking that principle. Watch how the game continues. White castles, black castles. And you might not think black has done anything wrong, but already white has a very powerful move. e5, chasing the knight away. When the knight moves, white can unleash a sacrifice that ultimately ends in a quick checkmate to black's king. And how did this happen? Probably because black wasted 1, 2, 3 moves, moving the same piece multiple times, but not really accomplishing anything. So try to avoid moving the same piece multiple times in the opening. Principle number 7 is don't bring out your queen too early. The queen is a very powerful piece, and as soon as you bring it out early in the game, you have to understand that any other piece on the board that attacks it is going to force it to move. So you can spend a lot of time having to move it around. It gets chased all over the place. That is exactly what we see here. Black tries to use the queen as a weapon to go on the offensive, and white simply plays the move d4, which unleashes the bishop. Now the queen has to move, otherwise it's going to be a bad trade. Queens are worth 9 points. the most valuable piece on the board. Bishops are only 3, so you don't want to make that trade. So they go back, but guess what? Now the knight comes in, and again, you have to move the queen. They swing it over here, but watch what happens. Again, you have to move the queen because you don't want to lose it to the pawn, right? So you go here, and now white has an amazing move. Bishop to b5 attacks the queen. And if you say, Nelson, the bishop's undefended, that's correct, but now the knight jumps in for a triple fork, and black is actually going to be losing their queen. After the king moves, the knight will simply take it. And all of this bad stuff happened to black simply because they broke the opening principle of bringing out the queen too early. So please don't do that unless you are an advanced player and you know exactly what you're doing. There are exceptions, but most of the time, you don't want to bring the queen out too early. Principle number 8 is that you want to pay attention to the f2 and the f7 squares at the start of the game. So the reason these squares are so important is because only the king is defending it. That's literally the only piece that's defending it, which means there are lots of tactics, there are lots of tricks. The 4-move checkmate happens on those squares, so you always want to pay attention. I'll show you a quick example here. This is one of my favorite openings to play against the Caro-Kann. I play knight c3, and I immediately bring out my bishop and line up on that weak square. And if black continues with kind of natural moves, bringing out the knight, I offer this pawn, and when they play bishop to g4, they've already made a critical mistake, because now I can play the move knight to e5, which looks like I'm losing my queen for free. But actually, I'm piling up on that weak f7 square, and now I have checkmate in just 8 moves. The king can't escape because the knight can't take my bishop because the knight. Very, very tricky way to play, but it all revolved around the weak f7 square. The same thing can happen on f2. So just pay attention if your opponent is attacking that, particularly with the bishop is usually how it happens. That's when you want to be really, really careful. Principle number 9 is that you want to avoid stalemate at the end of the game when you are way, way ahead. Clearly, white has a crushing position. Black is running out of options here. But if you play the move rook here, trying to cut off the king from escaping, you've created what's called a stalemate. A stalemate is not a win. It's actually considered a draw, which is not what you want, and that's what you have to avoid. So the general rule, if you are way ahead at the end of the game and you want to avoid stalemate, always make sure that the move you play is check, because if you're playing a check, it can't be a stalemate. So for example, here would have been a much better move because that's a check. I know it's not going to be a stalemate. Again, here's a check. I know it's not going to be a stalemate. Here's a check. I know it's not going to be a stalemate. And this is actually just checkmate. But you do have to watch out for stalemate when you're way, way ahead at the end of the game. Principles 10 through 31 fall in the intermediate category and are going to be most helpful for players rated 1,000 to 1,500. Now, while we're talking about 1,500, I want to tell you about my brand new course, Breaking 1,500, which opens tomorrow if you're lucky enough to be watching this video the first day that it's released. It's only going to be open for 5 days, okay? July 15th through July 20th, and then we're closing the doors so that I can really focus on everybody inside. But if you're serious about improving and you're rated anywhere under 1,500, this is the course for you. It's going to take you step by step in a systematic, efficient way. It's going to give you a game plan for what you need to work on, what do you need to follow, how do you need to improve and get past whatever plateau you're stuck at. Okay, I put a lot of years of teaching experience into this one course, spent a lot of time making sure it was just right, and I'm super excited. So if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description. Having said that, let's get back to the video. Principle number 10 is that you should develop your knights before your bishops in most cases. And so in this position, if black plays the move knight to f6, attacks our pawn, we want to develop a piece and also defend at the same time. We could play bishop to d3, which is not a bad move, but a better move would be playing knight to c3. This follows the principle of knights before bishops. And the reason this is important is because usually the knights are always going to go to these squares. We kind of know where we would like to put our knights. The bishops, it depends on what your opponent does. Sometimes you might want to, for example, deal with a pin on your knight. So you could deal with that by blocking with the bishop. Or maybe in other cases, you would want to, let's just say black does something else. Maybe you'd want to go on the offensive and pin their knight. You don't always know, and the bishops, the more information you have, the better decision you can make about where to put the bishops. That's why it's better to start with the knights and delay. The other reason is notice the bishops are still very effective, even from their starting squares at controlling the board. Look at all of these things that these bishops are controlling, whereas the knights are not really doing a lot when they're sitting back on the starting squares. They're only controlling a couple of squares. So that's another reason knights before bishops is the general principle. Principle number 11 is that you should connect your rooks. So what does that mean? Well, after you develop your pieces and you castle, there's sometimes still a few pieces in between the rooks, and you want to try to connect them so that they are both helping each other. So for example, moving the queen out of the way, followed by moving the bishop out of the way, now the rooks are what's called connected. And this is very nice because it gives them the maximum options. So for example, from this position, this rook only had one option. It can only go to one square. This rook could only go to two squares. You don't have a lot of choices, but as soon as you move the bishop out of the way, all of a sudden, 1, 2, 3, you have 4 options for that rook, and you have 4 options for this rook. So wherever you need them to go, they're going to be able to do it. Also, if you're following the other principles of developing your pieces quickly, fighting for the center, and castling early, the natural consequence of that is that you are going to be having connected rooks. So it kind of just goes along with everything else that we've already talked about. Principle number 12 is very related, but it's that rooks should go to half open or open files. Now, when we talk about an open file, we're talking about a file, something that goes up and down on the chessboard, a file with no pawns. No pawns of either color, that's called an open file. So this is actually an open file, even though it doesn't really look like it because there's a lot of pieces on it. That doesn't matter. There's no pawns on it, so it is an open file. So if I was following the principle, putting my rook on the C file would be a smart thing to do. That is an open file. Also, putting it on a half open file. This is considered a half open file. There's one color pawn on it, therefore it's half open. And then a file like this would be considered a closed file because there's pawns of both color. Okay, so closed file, half open file, and then open file is right here. So put your rooks on the half open and open files. Principle number 13 is that knights on the rim are dim. So when we talk about the rim, we're talking about somewhere along here, and a knight there is not going to be very effective. So let me show you this example. Bishop to b5. One of the ideas is that I would like to maybe trade this for the knight at some point if the circumstances are right. Black sometimes plays the move knight to a5. It's a tricky move, and they're basically hoping that if I'm not paying attention, they can trap my bishop with the Noah's Ark trap like this and win a piece. Also, they're avoiding the trade, not giving me the option to trade if I want to. However, when they play a6, all I need to do is move my bishop back to e2, and the knight on the rim now is actually very, very ineffective. Notice, it can't go here. I'll just take it. It can't go here. I'll just take it. The only place that it can go is back to where it came from, and that's actually one of the best moves according to the chess engine because it just is so useless over there. So they have to waste time going back to where it really should be, which is why, in general, just don't put your knights on the rim. Like, you just don't want to do that. They're more effective in the center. This is where you should look to move them to, and maybe somewhere like this, or like this, or like this. Knights on the rim are dim. Principle number 14 is that you want to avoid doubled pawns. Doubled pawns are 2 pawns of the same color on the same file. Let me show you an example. This is called the Nimzo Indian. And one of the ideas of the Nimzo Indian opening is that you're going to trade this bishop for this knight to create doubled pawns. So these are doubled pawns, 2 pawns of the same color on the same file. And the reason that they are not so good is because, for example, this pawn can never defend this pawn, can never help each other. Also, it's this one is blocking this one from moving, so they can get stuck. And they can become targets as an example, something like this. Black can play bishop a6, lining up. And they can play knight to a5, lining up again. And notice how this is a very weak pawn. Imagine if this guy was over here on b3, you'd have a nice pawn chain, everything would be defended. But because they're doubled, you don't, and they are targets. If they play something like c5, you can trade here, you can trade. And now you've created what's called double isolated pawns, which is even worse. And again, they are just targets. You can attack them. It's very easy to attack them because they can never defend each other. Okay, so try to avoid double pawns in a lot of situations, but there are exceptions, which we'll talk about some of that stuff in the rest of the video. Principle number 15 is that you want to avoid isolated pawns. So in this position, even though it looks very even, both players have 2 rooks and a bishop and the same number of pawns. Black's pawns are much better because they are connected. They're able to support each other. White's pawns are isolated pawns because they have no pawns on the adjacent files. So this pawn has no pawns here or here, therefore it's isolated. This pawn has no pawns here or here of the same color, therefore it's isolated. And notice how black is just piling up on that pawn, and white is going to have a hard time defending. And if this pawn was, let's just say, on c3, it would be much easier because the pawn could help each other. So try to avoid isolated pawns if possible. Principle number 16 is to avoid backward pawns. So let me show you an example of what a backward pawn is. In the Sicilian, the open Sicilian, after knight to f6, attacking the pawn. They defend the pawn. If you play the move e5 here, you let out your bishop a little bit. You attack the knight, which is nice. But the problem with this is they're going to go check. They're going to trade off this bishop. And then they're going to jump their knight to f5 and attack this backward pawn. So a backward pawn is a pawn where pawns on the side of it, so like this e-pawn, have been advanced so far forward that they can no longer support it. So it's called a backward pawn. Also, there's a half open file. So the opponent is able to attack it. Okay, imagine going back to this position earlier. If black would have only played the pawn up 1, this is no longer a backward pawn, because if it needs to move forward, it still has support from another pawn. But as soon as you play e5, it is now backwards. You no longer have any support if you're trying to move it forward. And it's a very weak and good target for the opponent, like we saw in this position. White is just going to pile up on here, maybe even castle, and bring the rook over and just continue to attack on d6. So avoid backward pawns whenever possible. Principle number 17 is to avoid moving pawns in front of your castled king. So here's a very quick example for you. Both players are developing their pieces. White castles early, which is great, and they have the wall of pawns defending their king. The principle says don't move these pawns after you've castled. White, after just a few moves, decides to play h3, probably trying to stop the bishop from coming here, but they violate the principle. Now you might say that doesn't look like a very big deal, but watch what happens in just a few moves. Black sacrifices the bishop on that h3 pawn, which was pushed forward, so they had the option to do it. Totally exposes the king. Notice the bishop over here is stopping that pawn from capturing, and all of a sudden, a few moves later, black wins the game and white is in trouble. And it all started right here when they decided to play h3. So avoid moving pawns in front of your castled king whenever possible. Principle number 18 is to not open the center if your king is still there. So in this position, you'll notice that white has castled. Their king is no longer in the center of the board, but black's king is. And if we here now as black decide that we're going to play the move d5, start to initiate some trades, it's going to open the center. And notice as soon as we do that, it allows white's rook to come over and start putting pressure on our king. Even if we try to defend that with a pawn, now they're going to play d4, keep attacking. And notice, we don't even have the option to take. We're pinned, and this is a big problem for us. And it all started because we initiated that exchange when we played d5, which opened up this file for the rook to attack us. You do not want to do that when your king is still there. Now, if we were castled and our king was off to the side, that's a different story. But in this case, not the best move for black, okay? Principle number 19 is when you are attacking, try not to trade queens. In this position, white has the queen in an aggressive position. They're trying to attack, and black plays the move knight to d5. Notice the queens are now hitting each other. But what you should not do is trade here if you're trying to attack, because as soon as the queens go off the board, it becomes much more difficult to get checkmate, and it's much more likely that you're going to go into an endgame, and the attack is going to be unsuccessful. So if you do want to attack, what's a better move? The move bishop to g5. You keep the queens on the board, you bring out another piece, you keep the attack going. And after something like f6, you could even play bishop d3, ignoring this and continuing to attack. Because as long as the queens are on the board, you are going to have a very powerful attack after something like this. You could even just castle. Black's king is a mess, and the fact that the queen is still there means you have very good chances of getting checkmate. Okay, so remember, if you're attacking, avoid queen trades unless you are ready and prepared to go into the endgame. Principle number 20 is that if you're in a cramped position and you don't have a lot of space, like black is right here, the best thing that you can do is trade pieces. And a lot of times you have to initiate that with some sort of a pawn break. So in this example, the move c5 would make a lot of sense here by black to start freeing some of the lines and diagonals for their pieces. For example, if white takes, now you take with your knight and you're getting ready to trade some more. And notice you're opening up spaces for your pieces to have options and to move. Okay, and the more that you trade, the more freedom you get. Even something like this, trading again would be good. And now the bishops can probably jump out. Bishop d7, something like queen b6, bishop f6 at some point. You have more options because you traded some pieces. So when you're in a cramped position, try to trade pieces. And then also, the opposite of that is also true. If you are playing, let's go back to this position right here. If you're playing as white and your opponent is trying to trade, maybe try to avoid it if possible so that you can keep them cramped. Principle number 21 is that two minor pieces, that would be a knight or a bishop, are both considered minor pieces. Two minor pieces are better than a rook and a pawn. A common situation where this might happen is this opening right here, where white decides to play knight g5, going for the fork because it's defended by the bishop. Remember, that's the weak f7 square that we talked about earlier. But as soon as black castles, it's now defended by the rook and the king. And white, a lot of times, will make this trade, but this is a bad decision. Because yes, you get the rook and the pawn, okay? But at the end of the day, you lose both of these. And this is where the principle comes in. The knight and the bishop are better than the rook and the pawn in most cases, okay? Even though if you count up the points, 3 and 3 is 6, 5 and 1 is also 6, it just works out that practically speaking, black is going to have the better position here. Why is that? Well, for one, look at the pieces that are actually active in the game right now. Black has 3 minor pieces, and white does not. The rook and the pawn that you got, probably not going to be able to use that until the end of the game, and so the middle game is going to be dominated by black, which is why they have such an advantage. Generally speaking, don't give up your knight and bishop for a rook and a pawn. Principle number 22 is that 3 minor pieces are usually better than a queen, even though they're the same points, 3, 6, 9, and this is also 9. The 3 minor pieces are usually better. This was an actual game that I played a couple of years ago. I was playing as white. I decided to play g5 to launch an attack on my opponent's king. I'm trying to open up this file so that I can use my rook and attack. But here my opponent played an interesting move, bishop to e6. They counterattacked my queen and allowed me to take the knight. And I realized that I would actually be able to get all 3 of these pieces for the queen if I wanted to. So that's what I did, because I knew that this principle, 3 minor pieces, is better than a queen. So I captured, they took my queen. I took here. Now I'm threatening to take the rook, so they dealt with that, but then I took the bishop. And here we go. I have the 3 minor pieces for the queen. And what happens is over the course of the game, the pieces are going to be able to control more squares, and because the queen is such a high-value piece, it can never really trade for any of your pieces because it's going to be a bad trade. So watch what happened over the course of this game. I'm not expecting you to follow everything here, but just watch. Slowly but surely, I was able to position my pieces. Notice how this is defended, this is defended, this is defended, this is defended. Everything is defended to where the queen doesn't really have any targets, and that's ultimately what happened. And eventually, later on, again, I'm just taking over so many different squares using my pieces that I was able to get a nice tactic. Somewhere here it happened. Got the rook, and then I kept pushing. I just have so many pieces. Here again, look at the bishop attacking this, the rook defending. It's so difficult for the queen to work because there's just pieces everywhere. Okay, and I ultimately went on to win the game and got into this winning position. Okay, so generally speaking, 3 pieces are better than a queen. Principle number 23 is that rooks are very good on the 7th or 2nd rank. So if you're playing as black, this would be the 2nd rank where they're going to be very good. Or if you're playing as white, the 7th rank is where they're going to be very good. So in this position right here, I actually sacrificed. This is a game that I played a couple of years ago as well. I actually sacrificed my knight so that I could get this position where my rooks and queen are lined up here. White decided to save that bishop, but now I can take here. And at the end of everything, my rook is on the 2nd rank. That's a very good thing because notice, I'm attacking all of these pawns, or at least I'm putting pressure on all of these pawns. I'm also controlling a lot of important squares that my opponent might like to use for their pieces. I'm also stopping the king from escaping. The rook just does so many things on the 2nd rank. And as the game continued, I actually had this opportunity right here to get 2 rooks, which are called pigs on the 7th or pigs on the 2nd, which is even better. This actually led to a very quick checkmate for me. Here my opponent resigned because if they try to move over, this is going to simply lead to a quick checkmate. You can see how powerful the double rooks on the 2nd rank were. So look for opportunities in your games to get your rooks on the 2nd or 7th rank. Principle number 24 is that doubled rooks on an open file are very good. So this was a famous game played by one of the world champions, Alexander Alekhine, playing as white. And black just attacked his bishop, and he decided to trade for the knight because he noticed that if black took this way, they would simply lose a pawn. So when they recaptured this way, they've created what's called an open file. We talked about this earlier in the video, right? An open file because there's no pawns on it. And notice, Alekhine has the control of the file with these pieces. And as the game continues, he continues to maintain control, and now at this point, he doubles up the rooks. Now that's especially good because it becomes very difficult for black to try to fight for control of the file because the rooks are here. And eventually he was actually able to invade and go to the 7th rank, which we've already talked about is very good, right? And watch what happens. After a little while, he gets, wait for it, there you go, the pigs on the 7th, just kind of like the game that I showed you a little bit ago. And ultimately, after some fancy tactics here, he brings the knight in. You can't take because it's checkmate. So the rook has to move. And then he actually goes here, which is trapping the rook. The rook has nowhere to go except back, but that simply leads to a checkmate by the rooks. And I'm not expecting you to see all of that, but basically what you need to understand is that this open file allowed white to do that and then eventually transitioned to the 7th rank. You can see how powerful the combination of those two concepts is. Principle number 25 is that bishops are better in open positions, knights are better in closed positions. An open position is a position where there's lots of open files and diagonals, like what you see on the board. In this position, white has the advantage because they have the bishops, which are able to just crisscross all over the board, control lots of squares, and are very powerful. In this position, notice the addition of a few extra pawns. Now it's closed off. The bishops are blunted. They're stuck. And the knights are going to be much more powerful because they can jump around and basically go wherever they want to go. If you want to jump in here or here or here, you can maneuver them around. Knights are better in closed positions. Principle number 26 is that when you have an option to capture with 2 different pawns, usually it's better to capture towards the center. In this position, white plays bishop takes bishop. You're trying to decide which way to capture. Well, the principle would say capture towards the center. You should take this way. Notice a couple of things happen. Number one, it opens up the rook, which is a nice bonus, but also we keep all of our pawns together as opposed to splitting them off. If you take this way, now this guy is weaker, backward pawn, because it's no longer supported, whereas when you take this way, you avoid that. Okay, so general rule is capture towards the center. Principle number 27 is that at the end of the game, your king needs to be activated. So in this game right here, black, it looks relatively equal. Both sides have 2 rooks. They both have 5 pawns. But what black does is plays king to e6. And notice black's king compared to white's king. Black's king is further advanced, more towards the center of the board, and white's is not. Watch what happens over the next few moves. This is far advanced, so the white rook has to stop it. And black takes this opportunity to invade with their king. White tries to come up. Black now forces the king to come back and then comes up with the king. And notice black's king is more active than white's king. And because of this one reason, black is going to be able to win the game simply by this check, forcing the trade. And at this point in the game, you might say, wait a second, white has 5 pawns. Black only has 4. But look at the king. Black's king is much more active than white's king, and black can simply... Actually, you could win this game either way. You could come over here and gobble up these pawns and win, or you could come over here and gobble up these pawns and win, and there's nothing that white can do to stop you. For example, if you simply just go here, take the pawn, start pushing this guy, the king could go and stop you, but then you come over here with your king, you take these, and you win. The active king, very, very important at the end of the game. General rule is when you're playing and the queens get traded, a lot of times that's a good sign to like, okay, queens are off the board. Now it's safer for my king to start coming into the game and doing stuff that's going to help you win at the end. Principle number 28 is that when someone fianchettos their bishop in front of their king, if you can trade it off, you're going to create weaknesses around their king. So in the King's Indian setup like this is very common where they fianchetto the bishop. That just means you push the pawn on the side and you put the bishop over there. If the king is behind that, a lot of times what I like to do is put my queen and bishop like this. This is called a battery. And you're simply going to come down with your bishop, trade it off, and once that bishop has been eliminated, the king is much weaker. Okay, this is a very strong defender to the king in this type of setup. So for example, I'm going to castle, and then I'm going to come down here, trade it off, and attack the king. There's also a bonus, is you can wait just a second, because it's not really going to go anywhere. If black ever tries to move it away, you're going to take their rook. And so what you can do is actually just leave it for a second and launch your h-pawn if you're trying to attack. And this guy actually stops them from playing h5, because sometimes, for example, if you were to play h4 right away, they'll play h5 and try to slow down your attack. But when you have that blockaded, they can't do that. And so, for example, you could push to h5. Now you could trade. You could open this up. And as an example of what could happen if black's not careful, you can simply come in and checkmate because the bishop is no longer there. Obviously, black had some better moves, but that's the general idea and a very good one to keep in mind. Create the bishop, queen and bishop battery, come down, trade it off. It's much easier to attack the king. Principle number 29 is that with the knight on f8, there is no mate. So if you're playing as black and you castle king side, one strategy is to put your knight on f8, which is right here, and it's very difficult for your opponent to checkmate you. So, for example, you can bring your knight up, you can slide your rook over, and notice what white is doing, trying to attack here, and they could maybe take your knight at some point and come down and take this and get to your king. But if you play knight to f8, even if they take this, it doesn't matter because you still have it defended by the knight sitting here, okay? And the thing about the knight on f8 is it's very difficult for your opponent to force that knight to move, right? It can just sit there. It's so well protected, it's hidden, it's hard to get to, and it's a very nice defender of your king. In some cases, you can also bring it up to g6 if you need to. You can use it as an offensive weapon as well. So keep that maneuver in mind. Basically, the way it works is you castle, you slide the rook over, and then you bring the knight from here over to d7 and back to f8. With the knight on f8, there is no mate. The same principle applies with white. If you castle, you can put your knight on f1, and black has no fun. Okay? Knight on f1, black has no fun. Knight on f8, there's no mate. Okay? Principle number 30 is that you should slow down and use your time wisely. This was a game played between two 1200 rated players, and at this moment in the game, black had almost 8 minutes left on the clock in like a 10-minute rapid game, so plenty of time, and they literally spent 2 seconds and played this move. They played this move after 2 seconds, lost their queen, and lost the game. It was a relatively equal position, actually, before that, and if they would have spent a few extra seconds, I'm sure they would have noticed the bishop. So just use your time wisely. You would be amazed at how many mistakes you can avoid by doing that. Principle number 31 is to don't play hope chess. Hope chess is where you say, well, I hope they don't see it. Well, I hope this will work out. Well, hopefully this might happen. If there is a good move that your opponent has, you need to automatically assume that they are going to play it, they are going to find it, they're going to notice it. Don't hope that they just don't see it. That's a terrible strategy. A good example of this is the scholar's mate, where you go for the 4-move checkmate, because a lot of people have the mindset, I hope they don't know how to stop this. I hope they won't see the best move. I hope they won't see what I'm trying to do. You don't want to do that, because if they know what you're doing, they're going to play g6, and guess what? Now you can't take here because they've defended it. You can't get checkmate. So you can try again and hope they don't see it this time. Guess what? They probably see it. You can go over here and say, well, I hope they don't see this one. But again, if they know what they're doing, d5 as an example is going to get you in a lot of trouble. If you take, they're going to jump in with the knight. Now your queen has to move, but where can you move the queen to? You don't have a lot of good options. For example, if you go to d3, bam, bishop to f5, and now you're getting forked the next move. Not a good way to start the game. If you go to a4, bishop d7, now where are you going to move your queen to? Again, you're getting forked. It's just a bad situation, and it all happened because you decided to play hope chess right here. I hope they don't know how to stop scholar's mate. Don't do that. Okay, principles number 32 through 50 fall into the advanced category, which is going to be most helpful either for players who are above 1500 or players who are trying to get above 1500. So even if you're below 1500, I still think you can understand these and start applying them in your games, but they can be a little bit trickier. Some of them, you have to know when you should use them and when not to. That's why they can be a little bit more advanced, but you should still definitely learn them even if you are below 1500. Principle number 32 is don't trade a bishop for a knight without a good reason. So the Ruy Lopez is a very common opening here for white, but after the move a6, you're actually not really supposed to trade here and go for this pawn capture because, first of all, you don't win a pawn. Black simply goes here and forks these pieces, gets their pawn back, but now you've given black the bishop pair in an open position. And remember, bishops are better in open positions like we already talked about. So you've already given black the advantage by simply making that trade without having a good enough reason. Now, if we go back, what would be a good reason? Well, let me show you this. Instead of taking it now, if you go bishop a4, you castle, you defend your pawn, and now, if black's not paying attention, now would be a good time to trade the bishop for the knight. Why? Because now, guess what? You get the free pawn, and remember before black played queen d4, but now your pawn's defended. You simply move back. They can't take your pawn. And so by trading, you essentially won a free pawn. That's a very different story than before when you didn't really get anything in return. So you can trade bishops for knights. You just have to make sure you're getting something significant back from it. Otherwise, it's probably not a good idea. Okay? Principle number 33 is that you should meet an attack on the flank with a counterattack in the center. So the flank would be one of these 3 files here, or one of these 3 files here, and then the center would be the 2 center ones, obviously. Okay, so meet an attack on the flank with an attack with a counterattack in the center. So in this position, f5 is called a Rousseau gambit, and even if you've never seen this move before in your life, if you remember the principle that I just told you, meet an attack on the flank with what? A counterattack in the center. You could probably figure out what move to play. Do you know what the Stockfish recommended move, the chess engine recommended move is? D4. Attack on the flank with the counterattack in the center. Now, why is this so valuable? Usually, if they're attacking on the side, they're not developing, they're not castling, they're creating some kind of weaknesses. And so by busting open the center and letting all your pieces out as quickly as possible, that's the best way to take advantage of it. Okay? Let me show you another example. We're going to flip the board for this one. If you're playing this as black, King's Indian setup, and what does white start trying to do? Attack you on the king side. A flank attack. So, what's the principle? Counterattack in the center. C5. They don't just try to ignore you, keep attacking. Watch what's going to happen. You take, now you're threatening their knights. They're like, okay, fine, I'll take you. Oh, boom, they walk into a tactic, and all of a sudden, white's position is falling apart. It's very difficult. Basically, what happens is it's very difficult for them to continue their flank attack and deal with whatever is going on in the center at the same time. That is usually why a counterattack in the center can be so effective. Principle number 34 is that rooks should go behind passed pawns. So passed pawns are pawns that have no pawns of the opponent that can stop them or capture them on the way to becoming a queen. So this is a passed pawn. This is obviously not, because we could simply take it. So rooks should go behind passed pawns. So what should I do if I'm playing this position as white? Well, rook to a3 would be a great move because it's going behind the passed pawn. Why is this so effective? Because I'm not only defending my pawn, but I'm defending it every step of the way as it moves forward and tries to become a queen. And black has to pay attention to this and can't just let me push it. They have to come over here. Now my rook is defending, constantly threatening if this rook ever moves. Okay, so that's a great place for the rook to be. Now, this is a situation where I'm defending my pawn. I'm putting my rook behind my own passed pawn. But it also applies in situations, let me go like this, where it's black's turn. And black is trying to think, okay, this guy's coming down here. How do I stop it? Should you go here? No. This is going in front of the pawn. Don't do that. Instead, you should come down here. And guess what? Go behind. Okay, go behind the passed pawn. Usually the rook is going to be more effective that way. It's going to be more annoying to your opponent. And you're going to be able to do other things with the rook while it constantly guards the pawn. Whereas if you would have just play, going back to here, if you just play this in front of it, after something like a6, now your rook is stuck here. It's not really doing anything else except that one thing. It could be much more effective over here. Okay, so regardless of if you're defending or attacking a pawn, rooks go behind passed pawns at the end of the game. Principle number 35 is that 2 connected passed pawns on the 6th rank will always beat a rook. So if you know that principle, in this position right here, you should know exactly which move to play. Well, push your pawn, because now you have 2 connected passed pawns on the 6th rank, and all black has to stop you is the rook, and it can't. Now, this is a different story if the king is like sitting right here and is going to take your pawns. That's different, right? But as long as there's no other pieces helping, the rook is not going to be able to stop these. For example, rook comes over here, you just push, and if they take, you get a queen. Okay? If they come, maybe try to come down behind, doesn't really matter. They try to stop you, doesn't matter, you push. You're threatening to get the queen. They take, you get the queen. You can see there's no way for the rook to stop the pawns. You will always be able to win unless there's some crazy trick going on in the position, like you're going to get checkmated. There's another piece involved, like a bishop or a knight or a king or something. That's different. But just against the rook, the pawns will always win. Principle number 36 is that you should attack in the direction of your pawn chain. So in this position, black's trying to figure out what move to play. Well, look at the pawn chain, and that's going to be a clue. So let's look at black's biggest pawn chain. Which direction is it facing? Well, follow it in that direction. So that's a clue. Black should try to attack over here. Which way should white attack? Well, find the biggest pawn chain. Which way is it pointing? This way. White should attack over here. Now, why is this the case? The primary reason is that you have more space in that area of the board. So because the pawns are expanded and extended in that direction, notice how black has all of these squares to work with, right? They can maneuver their pieces around all in this area of the board. Over here, they don't have any squares to use. Like all of these are, already occupied. There's not really any room to maneuver. Compare that with white's position. They have all this space over here, all these squares that they could use to maneuver their pieces around. They don't really have much space over here on the king side. So that's why you attack in the direction of your pawn chain. And if you're wondering, this was an actual game. Look what black does. They played g5. They played h5. They're attacking over here in the direction. White's trying to attack on the other side where their pawn is at, right? But eventually, and I'll just kind of jump to the end here so you can see how this finished out, black was able to neutralize white's attack. And then at the right moment, watch this. I want to get to the end to show you this. They sacrifice right here. They sacrifice the bishop to clear the way for the pawn. And they ultimately won the game. Now, long, complicated game. You don't need to get bogged down in that. But general rule, attack in the direction of your pawn chain. Principle number 37 is that knights are the best defender, or I should say best blockader of a passed pawn. So in this position, white has the passed pawn. It's very well defended. We don't want them to push it all the way down and get a queen. So we're trying to figure out how do we stop that? Well, we can use our knight to blockade the pawn. Now, one of the reasons why knights are such good defenders against passed pawns is because they jump over pieces. It doesn't really matter what else is around them. They can just sit there, blockade the pawn, and constantly be threatening stuff because they can jump over pieces. Okay, so knights are very good blockaders of passed pawns. Principle number 38 is that when you are ahead in material, you want to trade pieces, but not pawns. So in this position, everything is exactly the same except for this extra knight that white has. So white is ahead in material. So the principle says we want to trade pieces. So if you imagine for a second, if I just removed these bishops from the board, they were somehow magically traded. Would we appreciate that if we're white? Yeah, because now it's pretty easy. This knight is going to be able to jump around, take the pawns, and we're probably going to win relatively straightforward. There's not a lot of problems with that. So trading pieces makes sense. But if we trade pawns, well, what happens? And I want you to imagine, hypothetically, that all the pawns somehow just got traded. Okay, I'm just going to trade all these pawns. Now, of course, this isn't how chess works, but just imagine with me. All the pawns get traded, and okay, we're still trying to win the game as white. It's our turn. Wait a second. How are we going to win? Well, you're not going to be able to, right? Unless black gives you the bishop for free. Otherwise, you just can't win. Okay? You need some pawns to eventually become a queen. So when you're ahead in material, try to trade off all the other pieces, but leave the pawns. Now, sometimes you can trade a couple of pawns. That's okay. But you need to make sure you leave at least one or two so you can get a queen, because that's how you're ultimately going to win. So let me actually go back to, if I can remember what the original position was. Actually, I think I have it. So back to the original position. If you're ahead material, trade pieces, not pawns. Now, this brings us into principle number 39, which is the opposite. If you are behind, okay, so if you're black in this position, you're behind, you want to trade pawns and not pieces, okay? And it's exactly what I just said. Black would be happy to say, yeah, go ahead, trade off all the pawns, right? And leave the pieces. Because eventually you're going to win. However, you have to keep going, right? Because even if you stop here and now you trade these pieces, guess what? This is still an easy position for white, okay? So if you have to rewatch that one, you can. But basically, when you're ahead, you want to keep at least one or two pawns. You can trade the rest of the pieces. When you're behind, look for opportunities to maybe trade off every single pawn. And there might not be enough pieces left for your opponent to win if they can't get the queen with that last pawn. That's kind of the idea, okay? Principle number 40 is that one pawn can stop two pawns. So in this position, it should be a draw if white plays the correct move. However, if they make a mistake and play the move a4, it's no longer a draw. Now it's going to be a winning position for black. And here is how you would win as black. You would play the move a5. a5 is now one pawn that is stopping two pawns. Because if this pawn obviously can't move, it's stuck. If this pawn tries to move forward, I'm just going to take it. and I'm going to win this race. Okay, I'm going to get a queen first, right? And I'm pretty happy about that. So white doesn't really want to do that, which means both of these pawns are stuck, and I've done it with only one pawn. Now, why is that important? Because now I have an extra pawn over here, which frees me up. I can use my king to run over here and take some of these if I want, or I could just sort of use my king and these pawns to try to push forward here. I have all the options now as black because of how this situation happened. Now, bonus tip for you here. If white was smart, they would have played b4 instead of a4, because now I have no way to stop both of these pawns. I can't play a5 anymore. I just get captured. a6 doesn't really do anything, because now white just goes a4, I do something, and they push b5. They're going to get past in that situation. Now, white could mess up and play a5 themselves, and then, of course, it does sort of stop the pawns, although now they're further advanced. Okay, so it can get a little bit tricky, but the moral of the story is look for these opportunities, if your opponent gives you, to solidify stopping two of their pawns by only using one of yours. Principle number 41 is that you should try to put pawns on the opposite color as your bishop. So in this position, if I'm contemplating moving some of these pawns over here, I think c5 would be a great first move to consider, because it puts the pawns on the opposite color of my bishop. Notice how effective my bishop is now. I'm controlling all these squares. The pawns are not in my way. It works nicely with the black squared pawn, dark squared pawns, controlling all the dark squares. My bishop controls the light squares. Everything is in sync and in harmony. If you go back and I push this way, notice how my bishop is really not doing much. It's pretty much only the pawns that are effective. My bishop's kind of out of the game. So by putting them on the opposite color of my bishop, that's how my bishop can be most effective. Principle number 42 is that you should watch out for pawn storms when you are castled on opposite sides. So in this position, white decides to castle queenside. Notice the kings are on opposite sides of the board. One of the most common things that's going to happen is that somebody will launch an attack. Okay, it might be your opponent, it could be you. But you want to be aware of this when you castle on opposite sides, and either plan on how you're going to defend or plan on how you're going to attack on the other side faster. Or if you remember a previous principle, plan on how you're going to counterattack in the center when the flank attack comes. Okay, but when you're castled on opposite sides, this is much more common than if you're on the same side. Principle number 43 is that when you're attacking, you want to remove key defenders. In this position, white has been trying to attack the king over here. They have the rook, the bishop, the other bishop, the knight. But this knight on f6 is actually a problem because you can't infiltrate with your bishop like you would like to. So what do you do in this position? Well, the move is bishop to b5, because once you eliminate that knight, it clears up the f6 square and you can take advantage of that. Let's say this, watch what happens in the rest of the game. Eventually, there's a sacrifice. You get rid of the knight, and then you invade along these dark squares because the knight is no longer supporting. Notice there's all sorts of nasty forks and things that white can do now because you eliminated one of the key defenders when you are attacking. So, as a recap, if you're attacking and you're not sure what to do, I want you to step back and ask yourself, okay, which piece does my opponent have that is defending the key squares? And if you see a way to get rid of that, that's a clue. That's probably a good idea. Now, principle number 44, I wanted to kind of throw in here, but it's easier to attack than defend. Generally speaking, when people are learning chess, they're solving lots of tactics puzzles, and that sort of trains your brain to look for things offensively, which means it's usually easier to attack than to defend. And so when you have opportunities to attack, I think you should generally do it as opposed to playing passive and defensive all the time. Principle number 45 is if you see the move c3, you should consider the move d5. Okay, so when you're playing as black and somebody plays, particularly in an e4, e5 opening, somebody plays the move c3, you should consider d5. Why is this the case? Because a lot of times the drawback of d5 is that the knight is going to jump on c3 and attack your queen. That's no longer going to happen because there is a pawn there, which means d5 is a much more powerful move. The other thing is that if this trade happens, this is a potential weak square and a potential backward pawn that you can take advantage of. At some point, if you're able to push this forward, this is a very awkward situation for white, because if they move the pawn, you now have en passant, and without moving the pawn, the bishop is stuck, and white can get into all sorts of trouble. And so that's another reason. But generally speaking, if you see c3, d5. Now this happens in all types of different openings. Let me give you a couple of examples. Knight f3, knight c6, c3 is called the Ponziani opening. Guess what black's best move against the Ponziani is? d5, right? Just following the principles, okay? You're trying to just do something like this and have a great position. Let me show you another one here. d4 takes c3. This is the Danish gambit, and white is hoping that you're going to take all the way here, gets both bishops out, they try to attack you. Guess what a good move is for black in this position? d5, okay? As soon as I see c3, I'm always considering in the back of my mind the move d5. Principle number 46 is that when you see the move f4, you should also consider the move d5, okay? And it's different reasoning, but it's kind of the same move, this d5 move. So against the king's gambit, for example, the best move that black can play, or one of the best moves, is d5. It's called a counter gambit. But the reason is, again, they're not developing their pieces. They're opening up the king. And so the sooner that you can bust open the center, let out all the pieces, the better chances you're going to have. That's kind of the idea. Here's another example, the Vienna game. And after you play knight f6, if they play f4, the Vienna gambit, even if you didn't know anything about the Vienna gambit, the principle would tell you, well, f4, I should probably consider d5. Guess what the top engine recommended move is? It's d5, okay? Just on principle. It doesn't matter that you're losing a pawn here. You're going to get it right back here. You're opening things up. And a key feature, too, is that it lets out the queen. So you have options. Also lets out the bishop. So you have options. Also stops any ideas of the bishop coming on c4 and attacking you here. There's lots of good things about the move d5. And if you have a nice opportunity because of c3 or f4 to play it, you should usually do it. Principle number 47 is in queen pawn openings, you usually don't want to block the c pawn. So for example, playing the move knight to c3 is generally not a move that you're going to see by most strong grandmasters because they know the value of moving this pawn forward and allowing the queen to come out. Okay, so the queen's gambit, extremely common opening at the top level, and they have lots of options for the queen. It just works very nicely. But as soon as you play knight c3, it's awkward. Where's your queen going to go? You can't go there, so you have to try to find another place for it. It's just not natural. Okay, so in d4, d5 openings, usually you want to allow that c-pawn to come forward at some point. It doesn't have to be right away, but at some point to give yourself options. Principle number 48 is to remember the crooked path at the end of the game. Now, let me explain what's going on in this situation. This is a very, very valuable and really cool principle. White is going forward and would like to capture this pawn and get a queen. So they try to bring the king over. Okay, and black moves here. They try to bring the king over. Black moves here. They try to bring the king over. Black moves here. They go here. Black moves here. They take the pawn. Black's king comes up, and guess what? We are stuck. We cannot get out. The only thing we could do is go back and forth. And eventually, if we get bored enough, we can push our pawn. And black simply stalemates us. Okay, we have no moves. Game is a draw. So, can we, sorry, I just gave away the answer there. Can we win the game instead of going straight here? Yes, the answer is we can. And the way you do it is with the crooked path. So let me explain something first to you. If I want to get to this square, 1, 2, 3, 4 moves, and I end up on that square. Okay? However, I could also go 1, 2, 3, 4. And guess what? 1, 2, 3, 4. I also end up on the exact same square. Same number of moves, same square. What's the difference? The difference is by going here, I am able to box out my opponent's king from going to where they would like to go. And watch what happens. Now when I take the pawn, remember last time black's king was here and was able to come in and trap me. They are too far. Now I can come up and I win the game. Okay? So the way the crooked path works is essentially you want to do something with your king, but you also can do something else at the same time if you're smart about the direction that you move your king in. So rather than going in a straight line, you go like this, you box out the king and you win the game. There's some really, really cool endgame studies that show this, but the crooked path, very important to remember at the end of the game. Principle number 49 is to be careful with poisoned B and G pawns. Now, a poisoned pawn in chess is a pawn that looks like it's free, but when you take it, something bad happens, hence the name poisoned pawn. And a lot of times the B and G pawns can be poisoned. In the French defense, there's a line where white sometimes will bring out the queen. Now, I don't know the French. I haven't studied this. But what I do know is that you have to be careful taking this pawn because in a lot of cases, it's a poisoned pawn. As an example, if you take it, you think, oh, cool, I got a free pawn. Black plays rook g8. Now you have to move your queen. This is defended by the knight. And you think, oh, well, I'll take another pawn. The problem is, while your queen was off doing this, black now has the rook involved, the knight is involved, the bishop is involved, the pawn is coming through here. You have to deal with the pin. And basically, it's more trouble than it was worth. Okay, and that's the danger. And that's why you have to be careful about taking these B and G pawns, because they might be poisoned. Principle number 50 is that you need to be flexible about your plans when you're playing chess. So in this position right here, let's say white decides, you know what? I'm going to attack the king with a pawn storm. I think that makes the most sense. We're on opposite sides. Let me go ahead and launch the pawn storm. So they play the move g4. Black plays c5. Now, a lot of players, what they will do is say, okay, c5, yeah, whatever. Let's keep going. I'm going to keep launching my pawn storm, keep attacking. The problem is they missed an opportunity to simply take this pawn. Because now if black tries to recapture, look what happens. They lose a rook. They simply lose a rook. Actually, it's more than a rook, because you're going to get a bishop too. It's a totally losing position for black. But if you were so caught up on your plan and you didn't stop to consider what happened, you would miss that. Okay, very, very common mistake. People get tunnel vision. They don't realize that, hey, you have to be flexible when you play chess. Of course, it's good to have plans, but you have to know when's the right time to stop and deviate depending on what your opponent does. Sometimes they play moves that allow you to continue with the plan. Sometimes they play moves like this where it's better to react. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, you're going to love Breaking 1500, my brand new course, which comes out tomorrow, if you're lucky enough to watch this video the day that it's released. But it's a structured, step-by-step, efficient game plan to get you from wherever you're at past 1500 as quickly as possible. I spent a lot of time putting this together to make sure that it's going to help you the most. And so I'm really excited about that. It's only open for 5 days, July 15th through July 20th. Links in the description. I'll see you guys over there real soon. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.